Good morning and welcome everybody. I'm very happy to see many of my students and friends and colleagues here because, you know, we know it is exams time for you. So I thank you very much for having made this time for this very important occasion and of this conference of His Excellency. So in my capacity as Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University of Udine, it is a great pleasure and honor to give a most heartfelt welcome to His Excellency, the Honorable Mike Rann, New Zealand Order of Merit, Australia's Ambassador to Italy, San Marino, Libya and Albania, based in Rome. And we're very happy also to have Mike Rann's wife, Sasha Capozzo, here with us in Udine. Very welcome to her too. His Excellency is also the permanent representative to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Food Programme. He was formerly Australian High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, Premier of South Australia for 12 years, and leader of the South Australian Labour Party for 17 years until October 2011. Mike Rann also has a very significant academic profile. He's professorial fellow in social and policy studies at Flinders University in Australia, adjunct professor in public policy at Carnegie Mellon University, and visiting senior research fellow in political studies at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. He's senior fellow at the Centre for National Policy, Washington, D.C. Mike Rann has been awarded honours by the governments of New Zealand, Greece and Poland. For decades, Mike Rann has had very strong association with the Italian community in Australia. And this is specifically significant for our region, Friuli Venezia Giulia, with the many successful Friolan migrant communities that give an important contribution to Australian society, culture and economy. I'm very happy to say that the University of Udine has also a very special relationship with all these Friolan communities in Australia and also all over the world, and many student exchanges and research agreements with some of the most important Australian universities, in particular in the field of Australian studies, but also in other fields, in engineering and agricultural studies and science and so on, carried on by us in the past 30 years. Mike Rann kindly accepted our invitation to lecture at Udine, at the University of Udine, and he will talk about Australia, Italy, and the rise of China and Asia. So I'm very happy to welcome him here. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and Professoressa, and of course Deputy Vice-Chancellor, our other Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research, other lecturers, and also particularly to the students. Delighted to be back in Udine, and of course at this university, which is one of Italy's most distinguished universities, and particularly in the area of humanities and languages, is quite world famous, and one of only two in Italy with a focus on Australian studies. And so because of that, I want at the outset to honour the memory of an Australian, Professor Bernard Hickey, who did so much over so many years to build this bridge between us. Now, I visited your beautiful city last August for the first time when I was asked to attend a ceremony in a tiny church in nearby San Mauro. The church, on the site of a World War II POW camp, had been built by Australian and New Zealand prisoners of war. Most of the prisoners of war had been captured in North Africa following intense fighting in battles at places like Tobruk and El Alamein. The ceremony I attended was to unveil a memorial to 200 prisoners who died when an Italian ship, the Nino Bixio, transporting several thousand prisoners of war from Benghazi in Libya to Brindisi, was torpedoed by a British submarine, and so many of them died. In an extraordinary act of friendship, former Italian soldiers and other good people from Udine and the wider Friuli area have lovingly restored the church. As an Australian ambassador who was also raised in New Zealand and as the son of a British soldier who fought in World War II, in those battles, I was deeply moved by the ceremony and by the warmth of the welcome that we received from the Friuli people. The relationship between Australia and Italy is strong, diverse and growing. It also has a rich history. Very few Australians, and I'd imagine very few Italians, would know that a Venetian, Antonio Ponto, accompanied England's Captain Cook on his legendary voyage of discovery to Australia and New Zealand on the ship Endeavour. However, the first Italian to command a ship to Australia was the great Italian general, revolutionary leader Garibaldi, the first Italian to command a ship to Australia. His ship, the Carmen, sailed down the coast of Western Australia, a vast coastline. Australia's got 30,000 miles of beaches. Sailed down the coast of Western Australia before landing in 1852 on a remote island off the western tip of Tasmania. And his younger son, Giuseppe Garibaldi, later settled in Melbourne. But the real surge in migration to Australia occurred after the Second World War, when Australia was eager to boost its population. Australia is a vast country. I mean, many people say to me, "Oh, you were the premier of one of the smallest states." Yep, that's true. But it's still twice the size of Spain, or 3 times the size of Germany, or as I always remind Americans, 1.5 times bigger than Texas. But so Australia was keen to bring people not just from England or Ireland, its traditional sources, but from all around the world to come and migrate, particularly from Europe. Between 1947 and 1973, a massive number of migrants from more than 100 countries came to Australia, including 300,000 from Italy, and many received assisted passage. We paid them to come to Australia. And the Italians who came worked in our factories, farmed our land, built our houses. And these migrants and those that followed helped change the face of Australia, as well as help develop us as a country. And last year at the Salento International Film Festival, I launched the Australian film Lygon Street, Si Parla Italiano, which tells the story of Little Italy in Melbourne and the characters and culture and cuisine that Italy have given Australia, the most multicultural country in the world. Instead of a melting pot where other countries ask migrants to wave goodbye to their heritage, culture and language, Australia has become a stronger, richer nation by asking migrants to share their culture and language, as well as their skills and talents with their fellow Australians. Today there are 900,000 Australians of Italian origin from all parts of Italy, including the Friuli area. My wife, whose family emigrated from Puglia just over 50 years ago, is one of them. For countless migrants, Australia has represented opportunity warmed by the sun. And Italians are in every walk of life. A year or so ago, our Deputy Prime Minister was from Pugliese background. Italo-Australians are prominent in business, in science, in the law, in medicine, in universities, in sports, in media, in the film industry, in the arts. But while Australia has enormous ties to Europe, we are now firmly engaged in our own Asia-Pacific region. 75% of Australia's exports go to Asia. 1/3 of our exports go to China alone. For Italy, the Asia-Pacific currently represents only 12% of its trade and 10% of Italy's exports. However, Italy is also now focused on Asia. Indeed, the Renzi government says working with Asia is an imperative for both Italy and for Europe, given that Asia accounts for 54%, or the Asia-Pacific, 54% of the world's GDP and 60% of global growth. So it was not surprising that Mr. Renzi's first overseas visit was to China, apart from in Europe, where he met with the Chinese president, and a few days before, he was the first Italian Prime Minister to visit Vietnam since diplomatic relations were established in 1973. This focus on Asia by both Australia and Italy makes sense. When we map global consumption, we can visually see how things have changed and are changing. There's a computerized map which shows a pulse point of where consumption was occurring over about 1,000 years. For centuries, the economic pulse point used to hover right over Western Europe. And then from the late 19th century, it began shifting across the Atlantic with the rising economic power of the United States. And today we see it shifting eastwards to Asia by more than 100 miles per year. It's currently over Kazakhstan area. By 2025, it will have reached as far as central India. So Asia's re-emergence as the world's most dynamic economic region has focused many minds on the opportunities and challenges of what is sometimes called the Asian century. Half the world's population lives in the many diverse nations that comprise Asia. Or put it another way, 60% of the world's population lives in the same time zones as Australia. Australia's current and future prosperity is directly linked to the Asian growth story. Of our 24 nearest neighbours, 22 are developing Asian countries. Now, I just want to put Australia into context for those that don't know. Australia is a dynamic, wealthy and diverse country. We have had 23 years of continuous economic expansion without a single day of downturn, even during the global financial crisis. We have low inflation, strong employment, low unemployment, low interest rates, AAA credit-rated federal treasury. 4 of our cities are almost every year, every year, listed in the top 10 of the world's most livable cities, with Melbourne rated number 1. And as I've mentioned, we've absorbed many migrants with great success. It used to be that migrants from the UK were the most common. Only recently, however, it's been surpassed by China and now India as the leading source of migration to Australia. There are now 2 million Australians who were born in Asia, and Mandarin is now the second most spoken language in Australia, followed by Italian. Now, Australia is a vast country, but has only 0.3% of the world's population, less than half of 1%, but has the 13th largest economy. But we realise it would be a mistake to think geography alone will get us where we want to go, and somehow that we would ride or surf a wave of Asia's economic transformation. That never happens. You have to go out and make your luck. It takes foresight, commitment and courage. But I want today particularly that we'll put Asia's growth story into perspective for Australia and for Italy. During the Industrial Revolution, it took Britain 50 years to double its per capita income. Recently, China and India, like Japan, Korea and Singapore before, doubled their per capita income within 1 decade, and then went on to do it several times over. In 1992, China and India accounted for less than 1/10 of world gross domestic product. This has now doubled. Staggeringly, the Chinese economy is now twice the size of what it was 8 years ago. In 1950, Australia exported only 13% of its goods to Asia. Now it's 75%. By 2025, it's likely that 4 out of the world's top 10 largest economies will be in Asia: China, India, Japan, and Indonesia. Asian economies themselves continue to move up the value chain, developing new capabilities of their own. Asia has recently overtaken Europe in the share of world R&D, research and development, that it undertakes. For all of us, the speed and reach of these changes are unprecedented, with much more to come. Every day, the number of people living in Asian cities grows by more than 120,000 people every single day. The number of internet users in Asia has tripled since 2005 to well over 1 billion. Back in 2025, Asian incomes will be only a quarter less than that of the United States. Back in 1980, they were 1/30th of US pay levels. So with figures like this, very soon Asia will not just be the biggest global producer of goods and services, but also the biggest global consumer. And by the middle of this century, more than half of the world's economic activity will occur in Asia. These are staggering achievements. They have lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Today there are already 500 million middle-class people in Asia, and by 2020 that's expected to have risen to 1.7 billion. That means, and then by 2030 to 3 billion. Billions more people with better quality of life, higher incomes, improved education and healthcare, and for most part, greater choices about the direction their lives take. None of these developments have occurred by accident. Asia's re-emergence has been driven by changes to its own policy frameworks. And while we, Australia and Italy, cannot control what's happening in the global economy, we can determine what we can do to respond to the enormous changes that are occurring around us. And that's where hard work comes in adapting and reforming our own policy settings. So it's what was once referred for us in Australia, being on the other side of the world, as the tyranny of distance. Australia's geographic remoteness from Europe and North America has for us with Asia become the advantage of adjacency, with the world's fastest growing economies on our doorstep. But we know that economic success will not simply come to us because of geography. It's the saying that we're in the right place at the right time is in only part of the story. And that's why we have just signed in recent months free trade agreements with Japan, a free trade agreement with Korea, and late last year following the G20 in Brisbane with China. Only last week, our trade minister was in India and he's hopeful that an India-Australia free trade agreement can be signed by the end of the year. What we're saying, though, is that we need to really change the way we think about things. The previous Australian government made a commitment that Asian studies will now be a core part of the school curriculum of every school in Australia, with every student in Australia learning a priority Asian language, Mandarin, Hindi, Indonesian, Korean, or Japanese. It announced that our economy would become even more deeply integrated with Asia. To make even greater progress, there is now a strong and growing need for Australians and Italians to embrace Asia-relevant capabilities. Things like understanding the way that business is done in Asian countries. Things like having the appropriate cultural understanding to operate in different nations, and not least the language skills that enable us to negotiate and develop personal relationships in languages other than English. Research shows us that having senior leaders with Asian capabilities within a company significantly increases its prospects for success in Asia. In the 1950s and 1960s, there was a program called the Colombo Plan, through which scholarships were offered to young people from Asia and Pacific Island countries to study in Australia, Britain, New Zealand, and other developed countries. that was incredibly successful. When I went to Singapore, half the members of their cabinet had got their degrees at Adelaide or Melbourne universities. The Abbott government in Australia, elected in 2013, has now launched a new $100 million initiative called the New Colombo Plan, offering scholarships for Australian undergraduates to study and undertake internships in the Indo-Pacific area. So rather than inviting in people from Asia to come and study in Australia, which they do in their hundreds of thousands, we're now sending Australian students, giving them scholarships to go and study in Asian universities. It's a two-way rather than a one-way flow of students. So where does Italy fit into this picture? What does Australia's focus on Asia mean in terms of our relations with Italy and the rest of Europe? I guess my message today is this. For Australia, this great embrace of Asia does not mean a lessening of ties with Europe. Our engagement with our Asian neighbours and with emerging markets in Asia will not distract us from our traditional ties in developed markets. After all, Europe is still the biggest investor in Australia, with more than $500 billion worth of investment in Australia from the UK alone. Italy and Australia, both members of the G20, are already strong trading partners. But there is now a strong interest from Australian business in the current economic reform agenda now being pursued in Italy. And I think that Prime Minister Renzi's recent visit to Australia, the first of any Italian Prime Minister while in office, will further boost the relationship and business engagement. And a number of Australian companies are now looking at how they can invest in Italy. The Australian company Westfield is investing €1.3 billion to build the biggest shopping centre in Europe in Milan to create 17,000 permanent jobs. Similarly, the largest online real estate company in Italy called Casa.it, based in Milan, is also 100% Australian owned. And there's companies like Macquarie Bank with strong interest in increasing its Italian investments, Po Valley Energy with mining interests here in the north. Meanwhile, Italian companies are showing a big interest in Australia. Mape, Gela, Astaudi in the construction industry, Finmeccanica in defence, Intesa Sanpaolo in banking, and Salerno-based company Magaldi in renewable energy. Of course, these companies, or at least some of them, are not only interested in Australia for itself, but also in using Australia and its expertise to access those huge Asian markets I've already mentioned. And we're also proud that famous Italian fashion brands like Zegna, Loro Piana, Cerruti, and also Armani source around 80% of their superfine merino wool from Australia. And let's not forget that 812,000 Australians visit Italy each year, spending around €1 billion. And what I'm trying to do is to negotiate a new air services agreement between our countries that will benefit, with benefits to two-way tourism and business. In education, links between Australia and Italy are also growing. Last year, 5,500 Italians studied in Australia. That was an increase of 37% from the year before. In fact, the number of Italians studying in Australia grows by 30% every year. Now, education is important economically for Australia. It's now our third largest export industry. But for me, it's bigger and broader than that. The friendships and contacts made through education last a lifetime. And so does the cultural understanding that comes with studying abroad. Young people come home with a broader understanding, not just of their host country, but also of the world. And it's terrific that Monash University from Melbourne has a campus in Tuscany, in Prato. And just last week, the Australian Catholic University announced it's setting up a campus in Rome. So my message today, finally, is to say that Asia's rise will be as important to Italy and your future as it is to Australia's. Australia, with its deep engagement and close proximity within Asia, can be a bridge for Italian companies, just as Italy can be a bridge into Europe for Australia. And a Europe-Australia FTA will further open up opportunities for both countries. The challenge for young people like yourselves is to cast off notions about distance, never using the age-old excuse of troppo lontano for inaction, or pretend that somehow in this digital world that Asia and Australia are too far away. Anyone who says that Australia and Asia is too far away to do business probably will pretty soon be out of business. So it's important for all of us to get where the action is. That's the spirit that not only drove the Roman Empire, but also great Italian explorers like Marco Polo, Christopher Columbus, and even your great nationalist Garibaldi, who found his way down to Australia. It was the spirit of looking out, not in, of looking forward, not back, and of embracing change and opportunity. It's a great pleasure to be with you here today, and I'm very happy to answer any questions, but my Mandarin and my Italian aren't quite good enough yet. Maybe next time. Thank you.
I think it's interesting what you were saying about looking forward. We were having, you know, if you wish, you may sit here. We were talking about this last night. I think Italian young people are a bit, you know, on the low side of their emotion, but you said something very important last night about the fact that you need to have resilience, so, and look forward, as you were saying. So maybe you want to comment on this.
Thanks. I was in London just over a year ago at a meeting with some young people who came from a particularly disadvantaged area of London, as, by the way, I did, because I was born in southeast London. It's very easy for people to say, oh, it's too tough, can't do things, you know, it's too hard out there. Anybody who gives up without trying is basically putting the label loser on their forehead. And I'll tell you a story, and I told this to lots of people. I started out in journalism. When I finished university, or just before I finished university, I wrote this article. I was very proud of the article. I thought, oh, this is going to be a ripper, I'm going to be world famous. And I sent off this article to the first newspaper that I thought of, a local newspaper, and I got this thing called a rejection slip. So I thought, oh, that was a bit disappointing. So I tried another newspaper, got a rejection slip, and another newspaper, and a rejection slip. And this went on week after week. I got 23 rejection slips. One of them sort of said, nice try, try again. That was quite encouraging. Then suddenly my story was published in the New York Times. And so when I went to get an interview for a job, they said, but you've never worked, you know, people always say this when you've just left university, you've never worked before. Where have you had anything published? I said, the New York Times. Wow. And so I guess that persistence pays off. Commitment is really important, but so is persistence. And persistence means keep going. Don't let up. Keep knocking on doors. If people don't return your calls, ring them back and keep ringing. Persistence pays off. A friend of mine who left school at 15 and became Prime Minister of New Zealand told me, those who turn up win. Those who turn up prevail. Resilience is also important, and I've seen this in politics, that sometimes, you know, sometimes people are confident until they get a big whack in the head, you know, politically, all over the front pages. The important thing is to stand up and have another go, because those newspapers will be wrapping, who knows, rubbish within a couple of days. So sometimes they print rubbish. But the point is that it's really important to be resilient. Persistence and resilience, in my view, are the great keys to success.
Okay, so any question or comment from our students, my students, colleagues?
Obviously, we're involved in education here, and I personally am very excited to see a lot of Chinese and students in my classrooms, because in Australia I had a lot of Chinese students. And finally, I'm looking forward to seeing some Indonesian students, because I studied Indonesian at Monash. Ways in which, I suppose, what my query would be about is ways in which Italian universities and Italian education systems are going into Asia, if you could talk about that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert on Italian education in Asia, excuse me, but certainly, for instance, Monash. Monash is about one of the best examples I can think of. Monash is the biggest university in Australia in terms of the number of students. And not only did it have the vision, thank you, to establish a campus in Prato, which is about bringing students from Australian campuses, but also its other overseas campuses, to give them an Italian experience in art history, in law, comparative law with Italian law, on economics, a whole range of other, in architecture. All of those things make sense. But it also has campuses in Malaysia, in China, in India, and also now has a joint relationship with Warwick University in England. So I think that showed that pioneering vision. When I was Premier of South Australia, I brought 2 universities from overseas to establish in Australia. One of them was Carnegie Mellon University from the United States, and the other was University College London. University College London is routinely rated in the top 7 of the world. And so when I was going to Asia to encourage Asian students to study in Adelaide, I could say, not only do we have outstanding local universities that have produced Nobel Prize winners, we also have Carnegie Mellon and UCL. So I think it's really important for universities, as well as students and lecturers, to have brave enough to embrace international partners, not just signing MOUs, which sometimes get forgotten, but to actually build real links. I mean, my son, who went to both Adelaide University and Melbourne University, spent 2 semesters of his degree, which was he had a choice of 10, all students in his area had a choice of 10 universities around the world in which to study for 2 semesters, and that gave them credits for their degree. And he chose the University of Lund in Sweden. He could have chosen Avignon in France, or universities in the United States or England and elsewhere. So I think it's really important that universities are international. And some people, I think rather stupidly, look at the international ratings for the university generally. What I look for is the university rankings of the department, of the particular study area. Now people will say, well, University X is 200th or 300th on the list of world universities, about 20,000 universities or 50,000. What I look for is, because of my background, how do their politics department rate? How does their languages rate? I mean, this university is extremely well ranked. I think it was #1 in Italy in terms of languages. So you've got to look at the subject area. Bright people look at the subject area, not at the general area.
But you were saying something about, of course, the industry of the universities in Australia, which of course is very different from Europe, and particularly the Mediterranean and Italy. We have been using a document in discussions at the university in the past few months for our strategic plan for the future. And we'll be using a report, of an Australian document, let's say, and some challenging remark there says that Google can be the next competitor for all the world universities. So I would like to hear what you think about this.
Well, I don't agree with that at all. And I mean, the fact of the matter is that people want to I mean, there's a real difference between information and wisdom. Huge difference. I mean, I know I look at Wikipedia the same as everyone else does, and I see, for things that I know about, I see total errors of all the time, because who knows who's putting things into Wikipedia. I mean, in my Wikipedia site it said I brought the Guggenheim Museum to Australia. I've never met anybody from the Guggenheim Museum. I visited there about 20 years ago. So it's, you know, you just read these things. It looked pretty good actually, but maybe I should have. So you just have to be really careful. What you pick up on Wikipedia, I mean, people, you know, is often, it's helpful. It's a helpful guide, but it isn't wisdom or knowledge. And it's like universities that get rid of books and think that everything's going to be online. People want the best. They want the best for their children. They want the best in terms of prestige sometimes. And so, you know, I don't know, I reckon most people would think that a degree at Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard or language degree at Udine or other areas in wine research in Adelaide a lot better than going to Wikipedia.
Lighter note, you were speaking before about winery in Adelaide University. We are very, very strong in winery in Friuli, and we have, you know, in the agrarian faculty, we have a course on, yeah, so maybe we can have a talk about that.
Exactly.
And certainly there are possibilities there of exchange. You know,
and there's another, actually, Professor Esser's point is really important. You know, Australia is a long way away from the UK. The great wine regions of France are 26 miles across the Channel, but we sell more wine to the UK than France does or Italy does. Why? Because we got off our backsides, and that's, again, comes down to brilliant marketing and various other things, as well as a great product. Yeah.
And I would like to thank you for coming to Udine, and to Professor also to organize this important event. And I have spent recently 8 weeks in Melbourne, invited by Swinburne University, doing a research on Italians and Italian-Australian in the construction building industry. And I interview many Italian and Italian-Australian entrepreneurs, and they told me that they receive many CVs from Italians, from young people in Italy, asking for a possibility to work in their companies, because many Italians settle a very important construction companies all around the country. But these entrepreneurs told me that they found difficulties to call people to come to Australia. May I ask you if there is any possibility to promote an agreement between the two governments to let more easier to reach Australia as a workforce?
I mean, the question is relating to how can we make it easier for Italians young Italians in particular, to come to Australia and work for Italian companies that are involved in construction. I mentioned that there were companies like Della, Staudi and so on. There's actually been an increase of 108% in the number of working visas issued to Italians in the last 2 years. So that's a big jump. However, the problem is the EU. The EU have put restrictions on Australians doing likewise, which is why we are really keen to get a free trade agreement. We've got one with Singapore, Malaysia, we've got one with Korea, Japan and China, and with the United States and Canada. Australia wants a free trade agreement with the EU. At the moment, there are all of these impediments for Australians working here. So Australia wants an EU-Australia FTA. That will obviously free up things. The good thing is that in recent months, the Prime Minister of the UK, Prime Minister Angela Merkel in Germany, and a number of other Prime Ministers have come out in favour of having negotiations restarted for an FTA between Australia and Europe. So sometimes it's not because there are problems between individual countries, it's because they're covered by EU laws.
So I think we can close here if there are not other questions or comments. And I thank again His Excellency for coming here. Let's hope that this can be a yearly meeting here at the University of Udine. Thank to my students. I'll see you at the exam.
Good luck.
Grazie.
Good luck.